Hello, everybody. This is a bit of a different video than what you might be expecting from me on my Twitter page, but we had a really great Thursday night football game in the NFL last night between the Lions and the Packers, a showdown of some NFC North teams, and the end of the game sparked some discourse and discussion online, specifically about the Lions coach Dan Campbell and a decision that he made late in the game that eventually resulted in the Lions taking the win. And so, in case you are unfamiliar, this was the situation at hand. There was a tie game, scored 31-31 with 43 seconds left to go in the fourth quarter. The Lions had the ball on the Packers' 21-yard line, and it was a fourth and inches situation. Green Bay has no timeouts, and so if the Lions are able to convert a first down here, they'd be able to run the clock down, take a timeout with a couple seconds left, and kick a game-winning field goal to end the game and make sure the ball does not get back into the Packers' hands. And that was the big question. Do you go for it here on fourth down and risk not being able to score any points and allowing for Green Bay to go any drive downfield to try to win the game with a field goal? Or do you kick the field goal right here, try to cut your losses, and if the Packers are able to make their way downfield with about 35 seconds on the clock, they would only tie the game with a field goal being made. There's some pros and cons, obviously, to either situation. If you go for it, again, it takes the ball out of the Packers' hands until at the very least overtime. Because if you miss the field goal, then you would have to go to overtime. But if you make the field goal, then you just end the game right there. And fourth and inches is a very convertible area. You're also pretty deep into the Packers' territory, so they'd have to go on a pretty long drive in a pretty short amount of time, especially with no timeouts. However, if you don't convert, a field goal wins the game instead of tying the game for Green Bay. And of course, it always gets a little hairy when you're debating whether or not to go for it on fourth down just because of that situation. Now, if you kick the field goal on this fourth and inches play, you take the lead, you put some pressure on the Packers, and again, it makes sure that a field goal from the Green Bay only forces overtime versus losing the game as a whole. Where so maybe the downside of this is that you are putting the ball into a very solid offense's hands, led by Jordan Love, whether you make it or you miss it. So regardless of the result, you will still give the ball to the Packers, and if you miss it specifically, you will then give them that chance to win the game anyway. And so what ended up happening is Dan Campbell went for it on this fourth down. There was a bit of a scare there with Jared Goff putting his knee down, but because he was not touched by a Packers defender, he was able to hand the ball off to David Montgomery, who went for a 7-yard gain. They ran the clock down to 1 second left, and Jake Bates kicked the game-winning field goal, bringing the Lions to a crazy 12-1 record. And a lot of people online were calling Dan Campbell this crazy, brave, ultra courageous man who has giant balls like the one in South Park with Randy Marsh because he went for this play. Because, oh, what a risk that this could be. It could be an absolute catastrophe if it didn't work. But that did not necessarily match my opinion when I was watching this game. I thought that, in my head, going for it made a lot of sense in this situation. And so the question I'm trying to answer here is, was Dan Campbell crazy for making this decision, or was this actually a very sound decision? We're going to try to explain this using some pretty scuffed win probability math, but I think in general we can probably find a conclusion by running a couple of basic numbers. And so these are the numbers that I'm going to use for this potential experiment / simulation. According to Next Gen Stats, a fourth and inches conversion rate is approximately 77% in the NFL. Now, of course, this does not take into account, that David Montgomery is on the Lions, and he is one of the best running backs, specifically in terms of powering the ball straight up the middle in the entire National Football League. And if anything, that could increase the odds here a little bit. The other numbers here are that kickers convert about 93% of field goals between 30 and 40 yards. Jake Bates actually has been perfect entering this game, but you cannot, of course, take that into account by any means. And then this is the big one here. In the last 5 years, a team that is either tied or down 3 with a minute to 35 seconds left to go in the game from inside their own 35-yard line, which is likely around where Jordan Love and the Packers would be taking the ball upon whatever end of this play ends up being, whether it is a failed conversion on fourth and down or a made or missed field goal attempt in this situation. They make the driving team scores a field goal in about 36.5% of these drives. They score a touchdown in about 2% of these drives, and of course they fail to convert any points in about 61% of these drives. Also important to note here that Green Bay has no timeouts. This makes a drive like this significantly harder. I wasn't able to filter on StatHead how many timeouts were remaining upon a drive coming in. And then finally, I'm just going to say if the game goes to overtime, I'm going to give each team a 50-50% chance of winning. There's probably a better way to calculate this. I I didn't care at this point. I feel like a lot of the time you are just kind of flipping a coin, especially between two really talented teams here in the NFC. So let's go through the numbers first of what could happen and what your win probability would be if you go for it. Now, as we mentioned, there's a 77% chance that you convert this 4th and inches if you do go for it. And in that instance, I'm giving the Lions about a 99% chance that they're able to get a kick as time expires, and about a 1% chance that there's some crazy random turnover, which is probably being a little bit generous to the Packers here. But I'm going to say 99% of the time they get the chance to kick a field goal, and there's a 93% chance that they make that field goal win the game, and a 7% chance in those scenarios that they go to overtime when, of course, there it would be 50-50. Then, if the Lions do not convert on this, which would be in theory 23% of the time, there's a 38.5% chance that Green Bay is able to score because a touchdown or a field goal would end up winning the game. So you can add those numbers together, and the Lions would lose. And then there's about a 61.5% chance that Green Bay doesn't score on this drive. Game goes to overtime, and then again we get to that 50-50. You can check my math here in the comments if you think I did anything wrong here, but in general, I calculated this all to be that if the Lions go for it here on 4th and inches, that gives them an 80.9% chance to win the football game. In contrast, let's take a look at what the numbers could be if they decided to kick the field goal here. If you make the kick, which again is a 93% chance of happening according to the last few years in the NFL from this approximate distance, Green Bay will have an ensuing drive with about 40 seconds to go. There's about a 36.5% chance they kick the field goal and go to overtime, and which again, in that case, we're going to mark it down as 50-50 in those scenarios. A 2% chance that a touchdown would win the game outright for the Packers, and about a 61.5% chance that Green Bay does not score and the Lions win the game anyway. And then in the off chance of the 7% that they don't make it, there's the same 38.5, 61.5 that we had in the previous scenario. Because not making the kick versus not converting on 4th down essentially leaves Green Bay in the exact same spot with a chance in a tie game to drive the ball downfield and try to win the football game. And again, counting up all those numbers, that gives you about a 76.3% chance to win the game if you are the Detroit Lions by kicking the field goal. So again, by comparison, 80.9% chance if you go for it, 76.3% chance if you kick the field goal. So if you run the numbers outright, that gives the going for it team a little bit of an advantage in terms of these stats that I just put together. In conclusion, it probably increases your odds maybe a little bit, 4 to 5%. The other thing to note in this instance is that because there are no timeouts, that actually probably increases the odds here of Green Bay not scoring, which actually would help the kick it team in this situation. It would increase their odds by kicking if you did kick the field goal. So you could probably mark it up to be about a toss-up, but I think the big thing that this shows is that Dan Campbell has trust in his players to execute on the offensive end with the ball in their hands, specifically Dave Montgomery, who again is one of the best HB draw rushers in the National Football League, as we saw last night, as well as throughout this entire season. And at the end of the day, it is a bit of a coin flip, and there's just a lot of internet discourse, and I don't think there really was a right or a wrong decision here. I would have still gone for it because, again, putting the ball into your player's hands is always the name of the game, at least in my philosophy. And also the Lions are really good, and I think they're going to go to the Super Bowl. Okay, thanks everyone for watching. Goodbye.